On the edge of a quiet American town, night pressed down heavy. The sky was dark and restless, the rain falling in steady sheets that rattled against old tin roofs and washed the empty streets clean of sound. At the far end of the highway, a single light burned in a weathered roadside inn. Behind the counter stood Margaret, a woman in her late 70s with tired hands but eyes that still carried a sharp fire. Her little place, half store, half bar, half home, was all she had left after a lifetime of working. That night, as she stacked glasses and counted the last of the coins in her register, voices drifted through the thin walls. She froze, listening. A group of rough men sat near the back, talking low but not low enough. They spoke about the Hells Angels, who were rumored to be riding through town by morning. Their words were filled with plans to scare them off, rough them up, maybe worse. Margaret tightened her grip on the counter. Most people in town would have stayed quiet, too afraid to step in. But Margaret wasn't most people. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked right up to their table. The room seemed to still, the rain outside pounding louder than her shoes on the wooden floor. The men looked up, surprised by her sudden boldness. Her voice didn't shake when she spoke. "If you want trouble with them, you'll answer to me first." The gang laughed, but uneasily. There was something about the old woman's steady gaze that cut deeper than any threat. Margaret turned away and went back behind the counter, leaving the men to mutter among themselves. Alone again, she poured herself a cup of coffee and stared out at the storm. She was only one woman, small and fragile against the weight of the night. But something inside her said this was worth it. She didn't yet know why she felt so strongly, or what it would cost her, but the choice had already been made. And somewhere in the shadows of that rain-soaked highway, the engines of distant motorcycles were rumbling closer. The rain had not let up by the time the first engines cut through the silence of the town. Headlights glowed faint in the mist, and soon 6 heavy motorcycles rolled up to Margaret's little inn. Their riders were big men in leather, faces hardened by the road, shoulders carrying the weight of miles and years. The sound of their boots on the wooden porch made the walls tremble. People from nearby houses peeked through curtains, whispering about trouble coming. Most of them wanted nothing to do with it, crossing themselves and locking their doors. Inside, Margaret didn't move with fear. She wiped down the counter as if nothing unusual was happening. When the door creaked open, the bikers stepped in, shaking off the storm. The air grew heavy with silence. They were used to stares, to being told they weren't welcome, to being treated like criminals the moment they walked in. Their eyes searched Margaret's face, waiting for her to push them back into the rain. Instead, she poured coffee into heavy mugs and slid them across the counter without a word. The steam rose between them like a truce. For the first time that night, one of the bikers spoke, his voice deep and rough from the road. "Why aren't you telling us to leave?" he asked. Margaret looked him in the eye, steady as stone. "Because you're tired, and tired men need a place to sit." Her answer was simple, but it disarmed them more than a locked door ever could. She leaned in a little closer and lowered her voice. "But you should know, there are people here who don't want you around. I heard them making plans tonight." The biker stiffened, exchanging wary glances. Trouble was no stranger to them, but the warning coming from this frail woman carried more weight than the threats of their enemies. One of them, younger than the rest, frowned and asked, "Why are you even telling us this? You don't know us." Margaret's hands rested on the counter. "Because everyone deserves a safe place," she said, her tone quiet but unshaken. And in that moment, the bikers realized she wasn't afraid of them at all. She was standing with them. The bikers stayed longer than they planned, their heavy jackets dripping rain onto the old wooden floor. At first, they kept to themselves, speaking in low voices, but little by little the walls they carried around began to crack. Margaret moved slowly between them, filling cups, laying out slices of pie from behind the counter. It was the kind of care they weren't used to, and it showed in their uneasy gratitude. One of the older men, his beard streaked with gray, stared into his coffee before saying, almost to himself, "My mother used to treat strangers like this. Haven't felt it in years." The others went quiet, letting his words hang in the air. Another rider, his arms covered in ink, leaned back in his chair and told a story none of the others had heard. Years ago, when he was down to nothing, an old woman had taken him in for a night and fed him, just because she could. "She looked a lot like you," he said, nodding toward Margaret. She didn't say much in return, only gave a small smile that seemed to soften even the hardest face at the table. Then Margaret spoke of her past. She told them about her late husband, a soldier who came back from the war with a limp but also with a saying he repeated every day, "Our home should be a light in the storm." Together, they had opened their doors to anyone who needed rest, truckers, drifters, even men who looked like trouble but left with kindness in their hearts. The bikers listened, and for a moment the storm outside was forgotten. One of the youngest riders, barely more than 20, lowered his head and said quietly, "Feels like the first safe place I've sat in for a long time." His voice shook, and the older men gave him a pat on the shoulder, no judgment in their eyes. The room carried a weight now, not of fear but of unspoken respect. Margaret hadn't done much, just coffee, pie, and a few words. But in that small space, she reminded them all of something they had nearly forgotten, what it felt like to be seen as human. The peace of the night did not last long. Just as the bikers began to settle into the warmth of the inn, the sound of truck engines cut through the rain outside. Headlights swept across the windows, and soon the door creaked open again. This time it wasn't strangers looking for rest, it was the men Margaret had overheard earlier, the ones who had spoken of running the bikers out of town. Their leader stepped forward with a smirk, his boots leaving mud on the floor. "Place looks crowded tonight," he said, his eyes moving from Margaret to the row of leather jackets at the counter. "But this town doesn't want your kind here." The bikers straightened in their seats, their hands curling into fists, but Margaret lifted her hand before they could move. She stepped out from behind the counter, her frame small compared to the men who towered over her. "This is my place," she said firmly, her voice carrying more strength than her body ever could. "And as long as I'm alive, no one is thrown out my door." The room went still. The gang laughed, but their laughter was sharp and uneasy. One of the bikers leaned forward, ready to defend her, but Margaret shook her head. "Not here," she whispered. "Not like this." Her words landed heavy, not as weakness but as command. The men who had ridden miles on harsh roads, men who feared nothing, stayed seated because this frail old woman told them to. The gang leader spat on the floor and promised they'd be back. With that, he turned and walked out, his men following behind. The door slammed against the wind, leaving silence in its wake. The bikers looked to Margaret, unsure whether to be angry or amazed. She poured herself another cup of coffee, her hand steady, and said only, "Let them come. Some fights aren't won with fists." That night, as the storm held against the windows, the bikers made quiet calls on their radios and phones. Word spread fast. Margaret didn't know what she had set in motion, but she felt it in her bones, tomorrow would not look the same. Morning came slow, the rain easing into a thin mist that clung to the empty streets. Margaret opened the door of her inn as she always did, broom in hand, her back stiff but steady. At first, the only sound was the drip of water from the roof. Then, faint but growing, came the low rumble of engines. One, then three, then dozens more, until the ground itself seemed to shake. Margaret looked up and froze. From every direction, motorcycles rolled in, chrome flashing under the weak sunlight. Within minutes, her small stretch of road was filled with more than 100 riders, their jackets marked with patches from towns and cities she had never heard of. Neighbors pulled back their curtains in shock. Some stepped out onto their porches, whispering in disbelief. The gang that had threatened the night before stood across the street, their faces pale as the roar of engines drowned out their voices. The bikers lined up in neat rows, engines idling like a wall of thunder. Then one man, taller than the rest, stepped forward and removed his helmet. His voice was steady, carrying over the noise. "This lady gave us her word. Now she has ours. Anyone who lays a hand on her, lays a hand on all of us." The weight of his words settled heavy over the town. Margaret's inn, once overlooked and fading, now stood as the center of something much larger than anyone could have imagined. The gang that had promised trouble turned on their heels, knowing they had been outmatched not by fists, but by loyalty. Margaret stood on the porch, her thin frame dwarfed by the sea of riders, but in that moment she looked stronger than any of them. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, she simply nodded, her hand resting on the old wooden rail. She had made a stand, and now the road had answered back. The days that followed felt different in the little town. Margaret's Inn, once a quiet stop that barely kept its lights on, had become something no one expected. Riders kept coming back, not just the ones from that stormy night, but men and women from far-off places who had heard about the old lady who stood up for the angels. They patched her roof, fixed her broken fence, and painted the worn walls of the inn until it looked alive again. Some left money folded under plates, others stocked her shelves with supplies, but what mattered most was the respect in their eyes every time they looked at her. The townspeople, who once whispered in fear, began to see something else. They saw the bikers walking out of the inn laughing, carrying bags of food Margaret had packed for them. They saw the way the riders nodded politely when passing families on the street. And slowly, the fear gave way to understanding. Even the sheriff, who had avoided the place for years, stopped by one afternoon, tipping his hat to Margaret with quiet respect. For Margaret, the changes were simple but deep. She no longer worried about being alone. Every night, engines roared past her windows, a steady reminder that she was never without family now. Sometimes she would sit on her porch as the sun dipped low, rocking gently in her chair while the bikes rumbled down the highway. She thought of her husband's words, "Our home should be a light in the storm." She whispered them to herself, knowing he would be proud. The inn was no longer just hers. It had become a shelter, a meeting place, and a promise. A place where kindness had sparked loyalty strong enough to shake the whole town. Margaret didn't see herself as a hero, but the riders did, and the town had no choice but to admit it too. What began as one woman's stand had turned into something far greater, a bond that no storm, no threat, and no enemy could break.